Hi, Katharine.
Hi.
I'm Sarah Posner with Religion Dispatches, and with me today is Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. She's an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change. She's an associate professor at the Texas Tech University and an atmospheric scientist there. She has She's the director of the Climate Science Center there, and she's worked on numerous studies of climate change and is a well-known speaker and researcher on climate change. And she is also the author, with her husband, the pastor Andrew Farley, of the book A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. So thanks for agreeing to do this today.
My pleasure.
So let's talk first, excuse me, about Sandy and the relationship between climate change and Sandy. What's your view of how climate change affected the intensity of the storm itself, the catastrophic nature of the storm surge and the flooding? I know you have views on that, so maybe you can share them.
Sure. My views are pretty much the views of the mainstream scientific community. And that is, first of all, whenever an extreme event like this happens, we know that with one single event, we can't pin the occurrence of that event to climate change, because climate is the average of weather events over decades. So Sandy is one data point, so to speak, to add to our records in terms of looking at how climate change is interacting with hurricanes. So in and of itself, Hurricane Sandy was not at all unusual. We frequently get large hurricanes at the end of the hurricane season, which is now. And about once every 5 years or so, a hurricane actually hits the United States in the month of October. So this time it was Sandy. So in that sense, you can't say that that climate change really had much to do with the existence of Sandy. But what you can say is that climate change has acted to exacerbate the effects of Sandy. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, our sea level is currently 7 to 8 inches higher than it would have been 100 years ago. So when those storm surges come along, they're coming along on top of slightly higher background conditions that add just a little bit to the sea surge. Now, if we're talking about sea surges of 14 feet, 7 or 8 inches doesn't sound like much. It's just an extra 4%. But 4% is more than zero. So there is some little part of the flooding that would not have occurred if it wasn't for the increase in global sea level. The second way that climate change interacts with hurricanes is by changing the amount of energy available to the hurricanes. Hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water, and off the coast of the eastern U.S. in fall, long-term climate change has already increased the average temperature of the water by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, when the hurricane came along, the water was actually quite a bit warmer than just an extra 2 degrees. But part of that extra warmth that fueled the hurricane was coming from climate change. Exactly how much is tough to figure out. It takes a long time of crunching all the numbers to put a percentage on it, so we can't do that right now. But we know, again, that it wasn't zero.
So, but it's not possible to know without climate change what exactly the impact of Sandy would have been, but we do know that it was worse, more catastrophic in terms of loss of life and property damage, because we do have climate change.
Yes. Those are just two of the ways that climate change interacts with hurricanes, but there's other ones, like the fact that climate change puts more water vapor in the atmosphere, so when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor for it to pick up and dump, which leads to more rain. And then also, kind of at the cutting edge of climate science, what we don't really have a handle on yet is the extent to which climate change is affecting our weather patterns. So did climate change interact with the weather patterns that steered Sandy into the coast instead of out to sea like most hurricanes would normally do?
Right.
That's really an open question, but it's one that we have to look at.
Right. You can't just dismiss it and not examine what the impact of climate change was on that leftward turn that it took.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, your book that you wrote with your husband came out, I think, in 2009. Is that right?
It did. It came out just before Christmas 2009. So that's, 3 years ago now?
Right. And in that time period, I think that there have been a lot of people, not just yourself, but there have been religious people who have been framing climate change and other environmental issues as a religious imperative for them, but they haven't gotten much traction, politically speaking or policy speaking. Why do you think that is?
The science of climate change has become so politicized. If you look at Gallup polls asking people if they think, their perspective on global warming 12, 13 years ago, there isn't really much of a difference between people depending on which political party they're affiliated with. But now there's a radical difference in people's opinion on the science depending on what political party they belong to. And so, the science is not Democrat or Republican. The thermometers are not blue or red. They're just data. They're just facts. Now, the solutions to climate change are very political, and there should be great divides over which solutions are the best approach to take among, depending on which political affiliation you have. But the science is not political, but somehow it has become politicized. And in terms of the faith community, the sad thing is that many members of the faith community often take their politics as a guide to their faith rather than using their faith to guide their politics, is what I felt like. Because with the example of climate change, it's very clear that whenever any type of impact happens, that the impacts fall disproportionately on the poor and the disadvantaged, the people who are not able to care for themselves, the exact same people that we're told in the Bible that we are to care for. So biblically speaking, there's every reason in the world to try to mitigate the impacts of climate change and to try to help people who are being affected by it. But politically, that just hasn't been on our radar the last few years.
Well, it's interesting because after Sandy, obviously people of all different faiths and no faith at all felt compelled to help the people who'd lost their homes, who were displaced, who were injured. So you've seen an outpouring of charitable and community support for people in New Jersey and New York and Connecticut. And I've noticed, faith-based groups who might not otherwise, who wouldn't discuss climate change, but talking about what they're doing to help the victims of Sandy. And I just wonder, is the impulse to help the people disproportionately impacted by this coming too late or coming after the fact? I mean, obviously there's nothing wrong with the impulse to help people who've been impacted by a hurricane, but it seems like it could be taken a step previous, or several steps previous to the hurricane happening.
Yes. Well, I think that's where our human psychology comes into it, because we are great at responding to crises that we see right in front of us. But for the most part, the biggest impacts of climate change so far have not been observed in the continental U.S. Now, that's not to say we haven't seen impacts, because we have. Here in the continental U.S., our springtime is arriving about 2 weeks earlier in the year than it used to. We're seeing all kinds of pests and invasive species moving northward. We're seeing changes in our rainfall patterns and our temperature patterns. So we are seeing impacts in the continental U.S. But if you look around the world, the places that are seeing the biggest impacts are actually not right in front of our eyes. Like if you look up in the Arctic, over 200 Native American villages in the Arctic are at imminent risk. And by imminent risk, I mean the ground is literally crumbling under their feet and they have to move the entire village. We often don't see that with our own eyes. Over in Europe, back in 2003, they had a massive heat wave. It was a 3-week-long heat wave that, when the final counts were done, ended up killing 70,000 people. That's a huge number. And they crunched the numbers, and they determined that because of climate change, the risk of that specific event had doubled over the last 100 years. So they have these examples right in front of their eyes. In Australia, they had an incredible year of drought and wildfire and heat, coupled with flooding at the other end of the country a few years ago, which was exactly what was predicted as a result of climate change. Not in any specific year, but that was the pattern of climate change in Australia. So other places have seen things right in front of their eyes, and to a large extent, here in the continental U.S., we haven't. And if we had, I think we'd be doing things a little differently, because we are great responders. Like you just said with the hurricane, we're great responders. We do love to help people. It's just that we have this perception that climate change is about the polar bears and the penguins, not about real people.
Well, I think that Al Gore's movie really raised alarm bells about the impact on people as a result of climate change, and to talking about floods and the dangers to people who live in these low-lying areas near the water, coastal areas. Yet, for a lot of conservatives, it was dismissed, the whole line that climate change is a hoax and it doesn't really exist and it's not man-made, or it's not the result of human activity.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight into why that sort of argument? I think that one could see, not to justify it, but when you see the business community or energy companies disputing climate change or lobbying against cap and trade, you see sort of directly, what their interest is in that. Like I said, that's not to justify it, but it's, pretty obvious. But when you see people who claim to be religiously motivated talking about climate change being a hoax, maybe you've seen some of the people talking about Sandy or even Katrina being something that God intended or was sent to punish people for some kind of sin. I mean, what do you think the religious impulse is, or maybe it's more of a demagogic rather than a religious impulse to look at it that way? I mean, where do you think that comes from?
That is a good question. It's a question I've spent a long time thinking about. There are definitely faith-based questions that people have, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book with my husband, who is a pastor and a Christian author. We wanted a book that answered the questions about, if God is in control, how could something like this happen to our planet? Or, if the world is meant to end anyways, then won't this just kind of speed things up?
Right.
Or how could we think that tiny little humans are as powerful as the planet or as God? So there are some important theologically related questions to answer, but they're fairly straightforward to answer. I mean, in terms of how could God let something like this happen? I mean, look around at our world. Bad things happen all the time as consequences of our choices. God gave us free will, and with that free will comes the responsibility and the consequences. So in terms of, punishing us, the punishment for sin is not a hurricane. The punishment for sin is death. That's a verse from Romans. And Jesus died, took the punishment. So there's no punishment for sin, but there's just consequences for decisions. So with the hurricane, for example, if we hadn't built huge cities right on the edge of the ocean in a place that was subject to frequent hurricanes, we wouldn't have had this type of disaster. But we had the free will to do it, and there's many other advantages to building cities there that outweighed the disadvantages of hurricanes. That's just a choice that we made.
Right.
So I don't feel that there is any fundamentally theological or Christian basis to object to climate change at all. There is no verse in the Bible. In fact, there's many verses in the Bible that do talk about how we are free to make choices and we bear the consequences of those choices, and it's good to think about our choices because some of them might not give us the results we want. So then you have to say, well, then why this strong opposition? And part of that is the politicization of it I mentioned. It really is sad the extent to which some people have taken a political party's views almost as a statement of faith, and rather than, again, looking to our faith to inform our political views. But deep down, I think it's even a more basic issue. I think that we are really afraid. And we're not necessarily so afraid of the problem. We're really afraid of the solutions. What do I mean by that? Well, let's think of the main solutions people have talked about with climate change. They've talked about a carbon tax, and they've talked about government regulations, right, to limit the amount of carbon we can produce and things like that. Well, let's look back to the history of the American Revolution. What was the basis of the revolution? It was protest against taxation and protest against government control, imposing unreasonable regulations, right? So climate change pushes these buttons that have been part of the American psyche for hundreds of years. And people are very, very afraid of the solutions to climate change. And that's why I feel it's so important to talk about those solutions and to talk about how we can be investing in our local economy. We can be helping ourselves become energy independent. We can be improving the quality of our national security so we don't have to be depending on other countries for resources that are essential to us. We can be cleaning up our air and our water. I'm not talking about climate change. I'm just talking about, asthma, respiratory diseases. That stuff comes from fossil fuels.
So I know that there's been some effort to try to replicate the strategy that was used to try to stop the teaching of evolution in schools, or at least to try to get schools to, as it's called, teach the controversy, to try to claim that there's some scientific controversy over evolution, to apply a similar strategy to climate change, to get schools to teach the quote-unquote controversy, the quote-unquote scientific controversy about climate change in schools. And that, it seems that the opposition to teaching evolution was in part, or in large part, a religious movement, sort of conservative religious movement to deny the scientific reality of evolution. And that there's a similar movement underway with regard to climate change. I mean, do you think that it could have the same success, or do you think because climate change is in front of our eyes in a way that maybe evolution isn't, that would be a more difficult road for climate change deniers?
I certainly hope that it is a more difficult road. And not only that, but I think that there's a totally different time scale involved. I think that we really have the luxury of time to figure out any disagreements we have between each other on evolution and creation in the age of the earth, because there's not any imminent consequences for being right or wrong. With climate change, there are imminent consequences for being right or wrong. And the way I look at it is, even from a purely risk-based approach, which is, we cope with that all the time. We deal with risk every day of our lives. From a risk-based approach, I have to say, well, what if we take action on climate change to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and we're wrong? What are the consequences of that? Well, we will have shifted our dependence from finite and dirty sources of energy to infinite and clean sources of energy. We will have invested in our local economy. We will have cleaned up our air and our water, and we will have vastly improved national security. Those are the consequences of being wrong on climate change.
Right.
Now, look at the other way. What if you say climate change isn't real and it turns out it is? Well, you're screwed. I mean, the consequences are, you have already let yourself in for major reductions in food supply, major water shortages, having to build huge seawalls around 2/3 of the world's largest cities. They're within a few feet of sea level, looking at enormous shifts in the populations of our animals and plants and trees and things like that. Enormous increase in heat waves, higher energy bills, complete change of the places where we grew up. I mean, those are the consequences of being wrong. So whether climate change is real or not real, let's just look at the risks associated with being wrong in one direction or the other.
Right. And also, like you said, there are other benefits apart from halting or slowing climate change to some of the remedies for climate change. There are other benefits that who could complain about those other benefits. Well, obviously, there are people who do complain about those other benefits. That's an interesting point about it being being on a different scale, different timing, and different risks with being wrong. And it seems to me also that evolution the evolution denial has much more at stake in terms of, well, if you literally believe the creation story in the Bible, and I think for somebody who believes that literally, evolution, there's maybe more at stake for them to admitting that they're wrong about evolution. Versus if they admit that they're wrong on climate change, I don't think that it really undermines the a biblical narrative that they see as literally true. I mean, I don't see a parallel there. Am I missing something?
No, you're exactly right. There is no parallel. I mean, to agree that humans are affecting climate, we only have to think the world is at least 300 years old. So I think we all agree on that one. And again, there's no verses in the Bible that say that, climate can't change or people can't affect the planet. I mean, and there's lots of verses that talk about how we have to make decisions, and there's even an apocalyptic verse in Revelations that talks about how God will destroy those who destroy the earth.
Right. But I think a lot of people look at Revelation or some of the other books in the Bible that talk about the end times and talk about storms and pestilence and terrible things that are going to happen in the end times, and then say, well, look, see, this is just the stuff that's going to happen when we're almost at the end, and that's life. Deal with it.
Yeah. No, that's a valid question too, and I think it's a question that shows us how human nature never changes, because back in the book of Thessalonians, people were doing almost the exact same thing. They were quitting their jobs. They were sitting on their hands. They were saying, well, Jesus is returning soon, so why do we bother even working? Right. Let's just eat, drink, and be merry, and then wait for him to come back. And the Apostle Paul had to write to them very sternly and say, get a job, support your family, take care of the poor and the widows. This is what you're supposed to do, because you don't know the day or the time. Right. When the end is coming. And so I think that verse applies, or that passage applies equally to us today as it did back then. We just do not know. I mean, God could have, said that, the day will be X, Y, and Z, but he didn't, I think, for a very good reason. We're supposed to live our lives according to the principles he's given us, and the central principle is to live our lives loving our neighbors as ourselves.
So, do you think that Sandy has generated more interest in doing something about climate change, or given the issue a greater sense of urgency? I mean, are you hearing not just from your fellow scientists, but from your fellow Christians saying, this really opened my eyes, this is urgent, and this is a matter that we can't let go?
I think that the biggest impact of Sandy has been to open our eyes to how vulnerable we are to what I would call hazards. I hate to call them natural hazards, because nowadays there's no such thing as a 100% natural hazard, except for maybe, an earthquake or a tsunami. Those are 100% natural. But in terms of weather events, there is no 100% natural hazard anymore. I think that we live increasingly isolated lives from our natural environment. We have air conditioning in our cars, in our houses. We have all these things that insulate us from the natural environment. And so I think that our generation really has lost a sense of how vulnerable we can be. And so I think that the hurricane really showed us that we can be extremely vulnerable, even in the most urban city in the United States, even in the most sophisticated city, we can still be extremely vulnerable to the impacts of disasters like this. And so I think it's a wake-up call that whether or not this hurricane was related to climate change, it's an example of how we can be impacted by these type of events. It's not just about the polar bears or people who live on South Sea islands. It's about real things happening in the United States that matter to real people, our friends, our neighbors, our family.
So do you think that this is are people drawing the connection, do you think, between that, what you just described, and policy or legislative fixes that need to be made in order to halt or at least slow down the effects of climate change?
That's a good question. I think that people are making the connections between what I call adaptive policy fixes. There's two things we can do with climate change. We can reduce the impact we're having on the environment by reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and by using them more efficiently. So that's called mitigation. And then we can adapt, in other words, insulate ourselves against the impacts. So a lot of people are talking about adaptation. They're talking about seawalls. They're talking about ways to block tidal surges. And these are really important and they're really valuable. They're not the only people. Coastal areas aren't the only people talking about this. The Fish and Wildlife Services, many cities are planning for climate change adaptation. I just finished working with the city of Chicago for a number of years, and they're actually planning on planting different trees and plants in their parks as climate changes. They're looking at putting in green roofs to reduce their cooling costs in the summer. So they are adapting, and that stuff is really moving forward well, the adaptation policy. Where we're not doing so well is in the mitigation policy. That's actually cutting down, unfortunately, that's a bad word, cutting down on the amount of fossil fuels we're using, but it doesn't mean that we have to cut down on the amount of energy we use. We can still use just as much energy if we can use it smartly, more efficiently, and start transitioning in different sources. I mean, the United States is the most wasteful country in the world in terms of how we use our energy. But over the last couple of years, our carbon emissions have actually started to go down. Carbon dioxide being, one of the main heat-trapping gases that people produce. Our carbon emissions have been going down because we've been transitioning from coal and oil over to natural gas, which is way more efficient. So we're already starting to do this, and I think many of us just don't realize that.
So do you think that the cap-and-trade legislation that Congress considered but never passed would be a useful mitigation tool?
That is the intent of the policy is to mitigate climate change. There's that idea of cap and trade. There's ideas of carbon taxes. There's ideas of just trying to make a more level market where there's less of a subsidy and less of a financial support and less tax breaks for fossil fuels and more support for renewables. There's all kinds of different policy ideas. And honestly, I thank God I'm not a policymaker because there is no right answer to that one. Right. But what I do, though, as a scientist, is I can take the science so far. And what I can do is I can take the science to say, okay, if we produce this much carbon dioxide, here are the impacts. On the other hand, if we produce this other amount of carbon dioxide, here are the impacts of that. It's up to our policymakers and our decision makers and our leaders to figure out what level of impacts are acceptable. But that's a value judgment. As a scientist, we can't say, well, that's acceptable, but that's not.
Right.
But what we can do is we can make basically a laundry list. Like we can literally say, at this level, here's the impacts. At this level, here's the additional impacts. At this level, here's even more impacts. You pick which level is acceptable.
But first you have to get policymakers to accept the science and not dispute the science or not deny the science, which has been part of the problem. Yeah. So I know that there are different religious groups who have been involved in talking about climate change, lobbying for legislation like cap and trade. Do you have a sense of whether this is as a movement that's motivated by a religious impulse, whether that's growing? I mean, do you think that in faith communities this is something that people are waking up to and seeing as a matter of urgency, not just as an awareness issue, an urgent awareness issue, but also an urgent policy issue? Do you see that changing, or have you seen an evolution in that over the past 5 or so years?
That's a good question. I think that what I feel like I've seen, and again, this is just experiential, what I feel like I've seen is definitely a greater awareness. I feel like in the faith community, there are more people now than 5 years ago who are willing to consider the fact that this might be a real problem. And that represents some major progress. I think that where we are stuck, again, is on the question of solutions. That's where we just kind of tend to hit a wall. And I think part of the reason for that is because we have not had enough solutions proposed that are viable from a conservative perspective. All of the main solutions that have been proposed so far, like I said, involve words like cuts and taxes and government regulations, things that have been, dirty words in the American psyche since before the revolution. So,
not to everyone, but I see what you're saying.
yes, exactly. And I'm not saying to the entire population at all, but I'm just saying to enough people that those have represented an unsurmountable hurdle to getting legislation passed. I really think that there are potential options to address this issue without having to push some of those buttons, or with pushing a few buttons in a sensible way that people can agree on. Again, I'm glad I'm not a policymaker, because I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do, but I think that we could be doing a lot more than we are. And as a scientist, I can tell you that every year that goes by without doing something makes our job harder. I mean, it's like a student has an envelope with the money that they can eat off of that week, right? Mm-hmm. And every day you have a steak dinner ensures basically starvation and ramen noodles by the end of the week. So why would you keep on having a steak dinner day after day when you know that you're going to be miserable at the end of the week? Wouldn't you rather spin it out in a reasonable way? That's exactly the same way that I need to think of our carbon emissions. We have a certain amount of carbon emissions that are allowable with it, if we decide a certain amount of impacts are acceptable. And what we're doing is we're having a literally carbon steak dinner every year, right, until we start taking sensible action to reduce our emissions. We need to do that so that we have enough in later years, and so that our children can still continue to live just as well as we do, if not better.
Do you know whether there's any movement within churches or other houses of worship to do, an organized movement, not just a sort of ad hoc, different churches doing this, to green their own buildings? I mean, you see so many churches that have, the big parking lot and a lot of people driving and maybe not carpooling or walking or riding their bikes to church. I mean, I think that maybe there are ways that, I do think that there are some individual houses of worship who might be greening their own facilities and things like that. But is there anything broader based that you've heard about in that regard?
Yes, there are two organizations that are doing exactly that. If you can believe it, the EPA actually has a program to help congregations green their churches and their facilities. So the EPA has an entire office dedicated to helping congregations make their buildings greener and more energy efficient, which is wonderful.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And the second one is there's an organization called Interfaith Power and Light.
Yep.
It is an ecumenical organization that has chapters in every different state, and the goal of many of those chapters is to work with the local faith communities to help them become more sustainable and more green. So in November, on I think the 17th, I'm actually really excited because I get to go to Baltimore to speak at the kickoff of the new Maryland chapter of IPL. And then the next day, the 19th, or the 18th, I should say, I'm going to the National Cathedral, because the National Cathedral is actually having a program on stewardship and creation care where I'm going to be speaking about climate change.
Great.
So there are a lot of movements going on. And again, we talked earlier about how there's benefits to doing something even if climate change isn't real. So the benefits to greening your facilities, even if climate change isn't real, is you save money.
Right.
Using less energy saves a lot of money. And show me one church who wouldn't like to have some more money.
Right. Yep. Well, that's really interesting. I did know about Interfaith Power and Light, but I did not know about this EPA program. That's fascinating. So, well, listen, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this stuff. It was really interesting.
Anytime.
Okay, thanks, Katharine.
Thank you.